I'm Julie Herman of Jaybird Quilt, and welcome back to the Night Sky Sew Along. Today we're going to work on sewing our half blocks into a completed quilt top using the directions on page 12 of your pattern. So let's get started. Over the course of the last week, I have completed piecing my half blocks, and I've now put them up on a design wall. As you can see, I'm working on the baby size quilt. The techniques we're going to cover today work regardless of which size quilt you're making. This is the time to decide if you'd like to finish your quilt as a rectangle. I sent out bonus directions to everyone on the email list, so if you don't have those, go ahead and sign up below, on how to finish this as a rectangle. You'll add additional half triangles to the bottom and to the top of your quilt. This is the time to do that. Put those in place now before we begin the rest of the assembly. We're going to start in the top left with these two half blocks. So I'll see you at the sewing machine. Last week, I mentioned trimming the sharp points off of your half blocks to help with alignment, and I want to show you why I suggest that. So to put these two together, since I have those trimmed off, I'll just simply put them right sides together, and I know exactly where to line up my half blocks. Right there, and this one will be right there. Now, if I didn't have those, this is what it would look like. When I go to put my two half blocks right sides together, I don't know exactly how far to put it this way or this way. Sometimes people default to putting this, and if you do this, when you go ahead and sew your 1/4 inch seam, that's what you're going to end up with. It's not going to be a straight line. It's going to be offset, and then you're not going to be able to add your next piece. The answer to where it should be aligned is so that you have 1/4 inch from valley to valley, but that can be hard to eyeball. So I find it very helpful to trim those points off. So I'm going to go ahead and trim those off my blocks and then get started sewing. I've now trimmed the sharp points off all my blocks and returned them all to the design wall. It can be very easy to get mixed up with these half blocks, so I find it best to keep everything on the design wall and take down only the blocks I'm working on 2 at a time. So the first seam we're going to sew is this one. So as I mentioned, we're going to put those right sides together and line up our corners. And I have my machine set to the same settings we've been using during the sew along, which is a scant 1/4 inch seam. I'm just going to sew along this line. Sew onto my leader ender so I don't get my little thread nest. Okay, there is my first 2 blocks. And if you are going to square off your quilt, now would be the time to sew your half triangle up here. I'm going to leave mine with the hexagon edges. So I'm going to go back to my design wall, and I'm going to get my 3rd block, and I'm going to make sure, since this piece can get easily turned around, that's the direction I want. I have a pink at the top. So this is my direction, so my next block is going to go down here. So I'm going to put those together and sew that same seam. You can backstitch at the beginning and ending of these if you'd like. Most of them will get sewn into other seams, but some of them around the edges will not. So I now have those 3 sewn together, which is what I need for the baby size. And I'm going to head over to press these. And I'm going to go ahead and press these open. That way we're going to avoid as much bulk as possible when sewing our columns together. And I've got my heat resistant stiletto so that I don't get the iron close to my fingers. Do the same with the other seam. And remember, pressing is up and down. We don't want to go and move our iron like this because we could stretch our bias. The seams we just sewed were straight of grain, but a lot of our seams along our two long edges are bias. They're a mix of straight of grain and bias, and we don't want to stretch those. So I'm going to go ahead back to my machine and repeat these steps to sew each of my columns, and I'm going to put each one back up on my design wall as I go. Now sometimes when we sew these together, you'll discover that for one reason or another, one of your blocks might be shorter or longer than another. So if this happens, we want to do our best to ease them into each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just tug this top piece a little bit to get it to line up with that bottom piece and ease the difference in between the seam. So I'm just going to pull that top piece a little bit till they line up here. Hold that with a little bit of tension. And now they ended up lining up pretty well. After sewing half blocks into columns, the next step is to sew the columns together. And this is a step where people often feel intimidated and can have a little bit of trouble, but I have some tricks to make it a little bit easier for you. So when we're sewing our columns together, what we should be focusing on are points that we are going to see with our eye, which would be where our half blocks come together, and then where the next half block comes together. But things like this, where our background comes together, are not our focus. So we're going to focus on the alignment of things down here and up there. And what we're going to do is the hang pin technique. I suggest doing 3 hang pins for each star block. One where the points begin, one where they meet in the middle, and then again where the points begin. And then you'll just line these seams up. You don't have enough information here to do the hang pin, but 3 hang pins, 2 normal pins, every time your blocks line up. So let me show you what that looks like. I'm going to put my pieces right sides together. I'm going to take a pin and I'm going to go into my project right at the middle where all of my pieces intersect. And that should be 1/4 of an inch in from this raw edge. You see it comes out on the other side right where my point is. Then I'm going to go into this piece right where this point is. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to sandwich these together, and this pin is just going to hang there. And I want to make sure that it stays perpendicular to this piece and that it doesn't shift this way or this way, because then things will move around. So I'm going to keep that in there hanging just like this. And I'm going to take 2 other pins and I'm going to pin on the right and left sides. And I'm going to pin far enough away from my raw edge that I won't have to worry about these pins when I go to sew. So now I can safely take out my hang pin and know that that area is going to stay together properly. So I'm going to repeat that process down here where my point is, as you can see on the other side. And then I'm going to go through right where my point is. Sandwich these together and let my pin kind of hang there, hence why it's called the hang pin. And I'm going to take 2 other pins to place on either side. And as you can see, I'm worried here about where these 2 points meet. I'm not really worried about down here. If these are off by 1/16 of an inch, you know, almost even 1/8 of an inch, that's okay. I can work that out when I put my binding on. But if these 2 points that I worked so hard to make sure are perfect are off, you're going to see it. So do your hang pin, do your 2 pins, then 1 more hang pin. So again, in right where my intersection is. And this might seem like it's going to be a longer process, and it is longer than just putting the two of them together, sewing a straight seam, and hoping everything lines up. But I have found that taking time to do this now will yield much better points and much less chance of having to unpick things, especially unpicking the length of the entire seam later on. So again, that pin's hanging. Want to make sure it stays nice and straight. I put a pin on the one side. And on the other side. And then the two other areas that I want to pin are where my diamonds and my star points come together. So that's right here. I just want to line up these two on top of each other. Just see, so right now you can see the bottom one seems to be a little more over to the right. So I just want to shift that over a little bit till I get those lined up on top of each other. And pin. And the same thing for over here. And then I would repeat these steps for wherever my other blocks line up. And then before sewing the length of my entire seam, what I highly suggest doing is coming over to your machine and sewing where your hang pins are to make sure that things are lining up properly, because it's easier to unpick a small area if necessary than your entire project. So I'm just going to do about 1/2 inch on either side of the point, so about 1 inch or so at each of the intersections. And you can lengthen your stitch length here if you prefer, so that it's easier to take out if needed. Use your stiletto, go nice and slow. Move on to my next area. And you may notice sometimes that this is more than 1/4 inch in, or it's less than 1/4 inch in. And what I suggest you do is make sure your needle goes exactly to that point, because we know that our 2 points are on top of each other. So even if they are a little more or a little less than 1/4, what you want to be eyeballing is where those points intersect. Okay, and I've got one more. And as you can see down here, you can see more of my bottom fabric than my top. And what that must mean is that I had a more generous seam allowance on the bottom, but since I did my hang pin, those should line up perfectly. I'm going to take my pins out and see how she looks. And that looks pretty darn perfect. I definitely don't think I would have had points that look that good if I hadn't taken the time to do the hang pin. And again, there's my middle, looks really good. And that one, it looks like it's off a tiny bit, might have shifted. Or maybe I shouldn't have had that difference on the other side, so I might undo this one and adjust, but I'm happy with the other two. And so I'm going to repeat this step for where all of my blocks meet before sewing my length of my seam. And that looks much better. Got a few little stray threads I got to get rid of, but that looks better. So like I said, I'm going to go ahead and repeat to do more hang pins up here in those 3 locations. And once I know they're good, then I'll sew the length of the entire piece. Now that I have all of my hang pin points sewn and I have pins in at my other intersections, it's time to sew the length of my whole piece. And you might find that you have some of this going on. Because we're working with a lot of bias, because we're not always perfect, you might have some bubbling. And what's important here is, because you know that your points are matched up where you want them to be matched up, we're going to ease those in wherever we find them. So I know that these are lined up properly, so I'm going to sew from here to here. When I get close, I'm going to take my pin out. And now I'm not going to worry about the entire length at one time. I'm going to focus in sections, and I know that that's perfectly lined up. So all I'm going to do is give a little tug, not a lot, little tug to flatten that and ease that in till I get to this point. And these minor things can be eased in, and then they will end up flat once we press our quilt and quilt it. So again, I'm going to focus on here to here. And then again, here to here. Now I've reached a point where I don't have anything sewn yet, again, until I get to here. Because we have all background meeting background, it's not as important that all of these seams match. You should eyeball them to keep them together and make sure that you don't end up with too much on the top or the bottom by the time you get down here. But these don't need to match up perfectly, and I don't pin them because it's all just background. And as they say, it comes out in the wash. Now I do have more bulk here since I pressed my seams out from the border. There are 2 places, that being one of them, that I'm going to have more bulk. So make sure to use your stiletto if necessary. All of my other seams are nice and flat and pressed open. And now I've reached a point that I've done again. And it looks like I don't have a pin in here. So I'm just going to eyeball it, but I could put a pin in. Actually, I think I might put a pin in. And again, just as we did at the top, if I have a little bubble, just going to ease that in and focus on getting to my next area where I know I want my points to match. Take my pin out now that I'm close. And I'm just going to basically connect the dots to get to each section that I've already sewn. And now I just got to finish the end here, and I will backstitch since I won't be adding anything. And if you had added your half triangles, this would be a rectangle down here. Okay, so I now have my first 2 columns together. And I'm liking how this is coming together. So I'm going to go ahead and press this seam open and add my next column and repeat the same process with the hang pin until I have all of my columns sewn together. I've now finished sewing my first 2 columns together, and I'm very happy with how my points came out. I'm glad that I took the time to go ahead and do those hang pins. Now I'm going to press this seam open. So I'm going to flip it upside down. And some of the tools that I'm going to use are my seam roller, which is going to help me get things started. And then I'm also going to use my heat resistant stiletto to make sure that I keep the iron away from my finger, no accidental burns. This is my heat resistant stiletto. And I'm basically going to just walk my iron down my piece. I don't want to push because that's going to stretch any bias that I have and my seams. And I've worked so hard, I don't want to mess any of that up. So I'm just going to move it down a couple inches each time and walk my way down the piece till I get to the end of my ironing board, then shift my piece up and continue. I finished piecing my quilt top and I'm really happy with how it turned out. I think the fairy dust in the background really offsets the blocks nicely, gives a little bit of fun in the background, but the blocks still pop. Thanks so much for tuning in here today. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to like it, share your comments with us, and subscribe to this channel. You can also turn on notifications to receive an alert when we publish a new video. We'd love to see your night sky quilt top. Share it with us on social media using #NightSkyQuilt so we can see your quilt top. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll see you back here next week to discuss options for quilting and binding.